Della Harrow raised one gloved hand at the back of a cold warehouse in Ashford Bend, Missouri. The year was 1868. On the block sat a wagon of rifles, rust-welded into one dead mass, and not one man in that room would touch it. The gavel came down. Sold. $18. To the widow. She did not look down. She did not explain herself. Josiah Crandall, the biggest arms dealer in the county, said it loud enough for every man to hear. $18 for a widow's foolishness. Let her cart the scrap home. A dozen dealers stood in that warehouse. Not one of them lifted a hand to bid against her. And nobody said why. 3 weeks later, she was cleaning a barrel flat, the way her late husband taught her. And under 4 years of rust, something rose that was not a maker's mark. A shipper's stencil. And a row of numbers. If you have ever known the truth was sitting in plain sight, waiting only for someone to wipe it clean, then this story is for you. Before we go on, do me a small kindness, subscribe, and in the comments, tell me the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let me take you back to the river, and to a woman the whole trade had already decided was a fool. Ashford Bend was a small town on the Missouri, a day's wagon ride south of St. Joseph. In 1868, the war was 3 years gone, but its leavings still moved through the country like silt down a river. Surplus muskets, broken carbines, crates of iron nobody had a name for anymore. And the river itself gave up its own dead cargo, the freight of steamers that had struck a snag or burned to the waterline, hauled up and dried out and sold by men who cared only for the weight. Della Harrow kept a salvage yard at the north end of town. It had been Samuel's. Samuel Harrow had been the town gunsmith, a careful man with careful hands, and he had died 3 years gone, and the yard had come to her the way most things come to a widow. Suddenly, and without asking whether she was ready. She was 44 years old. She had a son named Tobias, 12, who worked the yard beside her, and between them they kept it running by the plain arithmetic of iron and walnut and honest weight. Old barrels went for scrap. Good stocks went to the men who fixed furniture. Locks and springs and screws went into a bin, and now and then a gunsmith 2 counties over would pay for a handful. Here is the thing you should know about Della before the room laughs at her. She could read a barrel the way a preacher reads scripture. Samuel had taught her, over 20 years at the bench in the back of the yard. She could date a lock plate by the shape of its hammer. She could tell London iron from Pennsylvania iron by the color it took in the light. She could look at a length of steel eaten half through with rust and tell you what it had been, and what it was worth, and whether it was worth anything at all. She was not a fool. That is the whole point of this. She was one of the most knowing people in that county about the thing they were about to sell her. But the yard was failing. There is no soft way to say it. The last 2 sales had barely covered the taxes. She had 3 $10 notes and some silver in a tin behind the stove. And winter was coming, and coal cost what it cost. She was, by her own reckoning at the kitchen table, a season from losing it all. A season from watching Samuel's yard go to the county for back taxes and become somebody else's lot. So when Amos Kettle put out word that he would sell a warehouse of unclaimed river freight, Della hitched the mule and went. Kettle ran the freight warehouse and auctioned what nobody came to claim 2 or 3 times a year, and he moved lots by the pound. He was not a curious man. Curiosity slowed a sale, and Kettle liked a fast sale. The warehouse was cold that morning. Della stood at the back in Samuel's old coat, which was too big for her, and she watched the men at the front. She knew most of them. Arms dealers, scrap men, a barge operator or 2. Crandall stood among them like a bull among yearlings, hands in his pockets, saying, "Little." Kettle moved the small lots first. A crate of hinges, a drum of chain, a pallet of stove parts nobody wanted, and everybody bought, because iron was iron and it always sold for something. Then 2 men wheeled out the wagon. It sat on a flatbed cart, and at first Della could not make sense of it. It looked like a single object, a great gray-brown boulder of a thing, but as it rolled into the light she saw the shapes in it. Barrels, bands, the ghosts of triggers and hammers all fused together. 40-odd rifles, she guessed, rusted into one mass by 4 years underwater and 4 years since. 40 rifles, maybe more, welded by rust into a thing that was no longer 40 of anything. It was one thing now. It was material. No provenance, Kettle called out. No papers. Come off a river wreck, best anybody knows. Sold as material, gentlemen, as iron and wood, by the wagon load. And here is where the story turns, though nobody in that room let on, because a wagon of 40 rifles, even broken ones, should have started a small war among arms dealers. Even rusted, there was walnut in those stocks. There were lock parts under that rust. A careful man could break that mass down over a winter and sell it in pieces for real money. Crandall himself had built half his trade on exactly that patience. Kettle opened the bidding. Nobody moved. He waited. He named a number, low, to get them started. Nobody moved. He named it lower. The dealers stood with their hands flat on the tables in front of them, or deep in their pockets, and they looked at the wagon the way you look at a thing you have already decided about. Crandall did not so much as blink. Della watched them, and she made the first mistake of this story, though it was an honest one, and I want you to hold it in your mind because she carried it a long way. She thought their silence was about her. She thought, a room full of men, and a widow in the back, and none of them will lower themselves to bid on scrap in front of a woman. She thought it was contempt. It was not contempt. Not only, but she could not know that yet. Neither could you, if you had been standing beside her. So Della raised her hand. $18, she said. It was near everything in the tin. It was a reckless number for a woman a season from ruin, and she knew it, and she said it anyway, because she had done the arithmetic her husband taught her. Walnut by weight. Iron by weight, even melted down, even sold as the lowest grade of scrap, the mass in that wagon was worth more than $18 to somebody who would do the work. And she would do the work. She was not afraid of work. Kettle looked around the room one last time, almost bored. 18. Any advance on 18. He was not asking. He was closing. The gavel came down. Sold. $18. To the widow. And that was when Josiah Crandall said his piece, loud, for the room. $18 for a widow's foolishness. Let her cart the scrap home. The men laughed. Not cruelly, most of them. It was the easy laugh of men agreeing with the biggest man among them. But a few of them did not laugh. A few of them just watched the wagon, and then watched her, and there was something in their faces that was not amusement at all. Something closer to relief, as if a thing they had been waiting on had finally gone. Della did not see it. She was counting out her notes at Kettle's table. 3 $10 notes she broke to make 18, and Kettle gave her back the change in silver, and she folded it into the pocket of Samuel's coat, and did not let her hand shake while anyone could see. She went out to hire the extra mule she would need to haul that weight. Now, if you have ever been laughed at by a room of people who were sure they knew better than you, stay with me. Because the men in that warehouse had made an error that morning. All of them together. And it was the kind of error that only surfaces when someone does the one thing you were certain nobody would bother to do. But that comes later. First, she had to get it home. It took both mules and the better part of an afternoon to move the wagon to the yard. The mass rode on the flatbed like a fallen idol, and people came out onto their porches to watch the widow Harrow haul her folly up the north road. Word travels in a town that size. By supper, half of Ashford Bend knew that Della Harrow had spent $18 on a wagon of rust that not one dealer would touch. Tobias met her at the gate. He was 12, all elbows and questions, and he walked around the cart twice, with his mouth open. "Ma, what is it?" "Rifles," she said. Or it was. "There's so many." 40 odd. Once, she set the brake and climbed down and stood looking at the thing in the last of the light. Now it's iron and walnut, and whatever's left worth saving. And it's ours. That night she did the arithmetic again at the kitchen table, by the stove, with the tin open in front of her. $18 gone. Silver enough for a fortnight of small things, if she was careful, and she was always careful now. Winter coming on. The taxes due after the new year. And a wagon of rust in the yard that she had to turn into money before the ground froze hard. The fast way was plain. Sell the whole mass, unwashed, to a scrap buyer, for whatever weight he'd credit her. Take the loss on the parts she could have saved, take the fast dollar, and go into winter with something in the tin instead of a boulder in the yard. And as if the thought had summoned him, the scrap buyer came the very next morning. His name was Deakins. He ran a barge and bought scrap up and down that stretch of river, and he was the kind of man who smiled a great deal and meant none of it. He stood at her gate and looked at the wagon and offered to take the whole thing off her hands as it sat for a price that would have gotten her through to spring. It was, Della admitted to herself, a fair enough offer. Fair for scrap by weight, sight unseen, no work asked of her. She very nearly took it. But Samuel was in her ear. She could hear him as plain as if he stood at the bench behind her. Clean iron sells better than dirty iron. Della, always wash it before you weigh it. A buyer pays for what he can see, and rust hides half of what he'd pay for. Never sell a thing you haven't cleaned. It was one of his rules, and he'd had a rule for everything. And she'd buried him 3 years gone, but she had not buried a single one of his rules. "I'll think on it," she told Deakins. He kept smiling, but something moved behind his eyes. "Wouldn't think too long. Iron's iron. It don't get worth more sitting in a yard. I'll think on it," she said again. And he touched his hat and went. And she watched his bargeman's walk all the way down the road and did not know yet that she had just done something important. She would clean it first. Not because she suspected anything. Understand that. She had no suspicion at all. She cleaned it for the plainest reason in the world, the reason Samuel had drilled into her over 20 years. A washed thing sells for more than a filthy one. That was all. That was the entire reason. And it changed everything. She and Tobias started the next morning. It is slow, ugly work, taking 4 years of rust off welded steel. You do it with a wire brush and a scraper and a bucket of oil and a great deal of patience. You do it with your knuckles and your shoulders and the small of your back. Della tied a rag over her hair and put Tobias on one end of the mass with a brush, and she took the other, and they worked at it the way you eat an ox, one bite at a time. The rust came off in flakes, and then in scales, and then, on the barrels that had been on the outside of the mass, in long bright curls where the steel underneath was still whole. It was better iron than she'd hoped. Samuel had been right, as he was about most things. Under the ruin there was real steel, and here and there a stalk of good black walnut that had somehow kept its grain. They worked 2 days. On the 3rd day, in the 3rd week, Tobias found the letters. He was working a barrel flat, one of the outermost ones, brushing along the underside, where the rust had been thickest. And he stopped, and he went very still, in the way children go still when they're not sure if they've broken something. "Ma, keep at it. Ma, there's writing." She came around the mass, wiping her hands. She thought he'd found a maker's mark. That would be ordinary. Every good barrel had one, stamped near the breech, and finding a name would tell her the maker and the year, and might even raise the price of that one piece. But it was not near the breech. It was along the flat of the barrel, where no maker stamps a name. And it was not stamped at all. It was painted. Painted in a hard black that had somehow held under the water and the years, revealed now where Tobias's brush had cut a window in the rust. It was a stencil. Not a maker's mark. A shipper's stencil. The kind of thing painted on the outside of a crate, not the inside of a gun. A name across the top, in blocky letters, and under the name, a row of numbers. Della crouched down and looked at it for a long time. "What's it say?" Tobias asked. "Give me a rag." She wiped it clean, gently, the way you wipe a thing you don't want to damage. The name came up first, then the numbers, one at a time, as the black oil lifted the last of the grime. A name she did not know, a row of numbers that meant nothing to her yet. But here is what she did understand, crouched in the cold with her son's brush in her hand. A maker marks a gun. A shipper marks a crate. This mark was on the gun itself, painted, the way you'd mark freight that had to be tracked, that had to be identified, that somebody wanted to be able to name later. Somebody had wanted to know these particular rifles anywhere. And that was a strange thing to want, for surplus iron that Kettle had sold with his own mouth as having no provenance and no papers. She copied the name and the numbers into the little account book she kept in her apron pocket. She wrote them exactly. Samuel had taught her that too. When you don't understand a thing yet, write it down exactly and let the meaning come later. "Is it worth something?" Tobias asked. "I don't know yet," she said, and it was the truest thing she'd said in a week. "Keep cleaning. And Toby, don't talk about this in town." He looked at her, and something passed between them, and he nodded. He was 12, but he was not stupid, and his mother did not say don't talk about it for no reason. They cleaned 2 more days. And on one of those days, Deacons came back. He came back different. That is the thing Della noticed, though she still could not have told you why it mattered. The first time he'd been easy, smiling, a man doing routine business. This time, he was eager. He stood at the gate and looked at the wagon, and the mass was half cleaned now, bright steel showing through where they'd worked, and something in his face tightened when he saw it. He raised his offer. Not by a little. By a lot. He offered to take the whole lot, as is, that very day, for near double what he'd said before. He wanted it gone. He wanted it on his barge and down the river, today, and he could not quite keep the wanting out of his voice. Della stood with the wire brush still in her hand and looked at him. Now, I want to be fair to her, because she was not a schemer and she never became one, not in this whole story. She did not look at Deacons and think, aha, he knows something. She was tired and cold, and her hands were bleeding at the knuckles, and a man was offering her real money, and part of her wanted very badly to take it and be done. But she had not finished cleaning. And a thing not finished was a thing not sold. That was Samuel's rule, and she held to it the way a person in cold water holds to a rope. Not because she understood the whole river, but because the rope was there, and her husband had put it in her hand. "I haven't finished it," she said. "I don't sell what I haven't finished. It's scrap, Della." He used her name now. Familiar, coaxing. "You're brushing gold leaf onto a hog. It's the same iron clean as dirty. Take the money." "Then it costs you nothing to wait till I'm done," she said. His smile stayed. His eyes did not. "Suit yourself," he said, and he left again, faster this time, and she watched him go and felt the ground shift very slightly under her, the way you feel a footbridge move before you understand it's not steady. She did not know what it meant, but she knew it meant something now. A man doesn't double his price for a hog. She went back to work with a colder feeling in her chest than the weather could account for. And then the lot gave up its second secret. She had worked her way inward, to the rifles that had been sheltered at the heart of the mass, less eaten than the ones outside. She could free some of them now, one at a time, where the rust had let go. And on one of them she did what Samuel had always done last, before he priced any gun. She took off the lock plate. The lock plate is the flat steel piece that holds the firing mechanism. You take it off with a turn screw, and underneath, in the wood, is where a careful gunsmith sometimes finds the private marks. The maker's real stamp. An inspector's initials. The small hidden truths a gun carries where the buyer never looks. And stamped on the inside of that lock plate, where no customer would ever see it, was a number. The same row of numbers as the stencil on the barrel. Della sat back on her heels. She took off a second lock plate from a different rifle, one that had been on the far side of the mass, that could not have touched the first one in years. Same turn screw, same careful hands. And inside that one, stamped in the steel, the same number again. The same consignment number, stamped inside two separate rifles, hidden, deliberate, not a coincidence of a single crate. This was a whole shipment, marked twice over. Once on the outside, in paint, where a shipper could read it, and once on the inside, in steel, where it could never be scrubbed off, never be lost, never be denied. Somebody had wanted these guns provable. Somebody had wanted to be able to say, beyond any argument, these ones. These exact ones. This shipment. Guns that Kettle had sold as having no provenance and no papers. Della sat in the cold yard with the turn screw in her hand and her son watching her from across the wagon, and she understood, finally, that she had not bought scrap. She did not know what she had bought, but she knew it was not scrap, and she knew that a dozen dealers had sat on their hands rather than bid on it, and she knew that a scrap buyer had doubled his price to take it away before she finished cleaning. And those three facts, laid side by side, made a shape she did not like at all. "Ma," Tobias said quietly. "What is it, really?" "I don't know," she said. "But I'm going to find out, and you're going to keep this between us." Every word. She copied the number again, next to the first, and she closed the account book, and she looked at the row of clean rifles she'd freed from the mass, and one of them she set aside. The clearest one, the one whose stencil had come up best, whose lock plate read plainest. She carried it into the little office by the yard gate, and she hung it on the wall by the door, where she could see it. She did not fully know why. It felt like keeping a witness. The next morning she walked into town, to the county recorder's office at the courthouse, with the name from the stencil written in her book. The recorder's office kept the county's public papers, and among them the loss files, the records of freight and vessels declared lost on that stretch of the river, filed by the men who claimed against them. Della knew the name in her book was a shipper's name, or a cargo's name, and she knew shippers filed losses, and she knew where losses were filed. Samuel had sent her to that office a dozen times over the years to check a title or trace a maker. She knew the drawers. It took her the better part of an hour. The clerk was incurious, and left her to it. She worked back through the years, and the name from her stencil she found at last in a 4-year-old entry, in a bound ledger that smelled of dust and river damp. The name matched, and beside the name was a date. The winter of 1864, and a description of a cargo and a vessel, a steamer, lost on the Missouri that winter, gone down with all its freight, or so the file said. And in the margin, in a different hand, a single word had been entered later. Paid. Della stood very still in the cold basement of the courthouse and read that word 4 or 5 times. Paid. The claim had been made, and the claim had been settled, and somebody in Hartford or Boston or wherever the underwriters kept their money had opened a strongbox in 1864 and paid out, in full, for a cargo declared to be at the bottom of the river. The same cargo, she was nearly certain, that was sitting half-cleaned in her yard, marked twice over so nobody could ever mistake it. And here is where all of Samuel's teaching came to a point, and where a woman the whole town had called a fool understood something not one of those laughing dealers had bothered to understand. Because Della knew a little of how the world of goods and money worked. When an underwriter pays a claim in full, the goods become the underwriter's. That is the law of it. You cannot collect the money for a thing and keep the thing too. If they paid for these rifles, then the rifles were theirs from that moment on, whatever happened to them after. Which meant these guns had never been hers to melt. And they had never been Kettle's to sell as unclaimed freight. And they had never been anyone's in Ashford Bend to touch at all. Because they were supposed to be gone. They were supposed to be at the bottom of the Missouri River, drowned in the winter of 1864, paid for and finished and forgotten. Not sitting in a warehouse, not rolling across an auction floor, not welded into a boulder of rust that a dozen men who knew the trade had all, to a man, refused to bid on. She copied the 1864 entry into her book beneath the stencil and the numbers. She thanked the clerk, who did not look up. And she walked back up the north road to her yard in the last week of October, with the whole shape of it turning slowly in her mind. A shipment reported sunk, paid out. And here, dry, in the same town as the men who wouldn't bid. She could have done a great many things with what she knew. She could have gone straight to Crandall and named it to his face. She could have gone to Kettle and demanded her money back with interest. She could have quietly sold the rifles for what they were truly worth, real guns with real steel, to some dealer 3 counties over who'd ask no questions. She could have gone loud, or gone greedy, or gone for revenge on the men who had laughed. She did none of it. Understand who she was. She was not a schemer. She had never in her life set a trap for another person, and she did not begin now. She sat down that evening at Samuel's bench, in the back of the yard, with the smell of oil and iron around her that was the smell of her whole married life. And she thought about who had actually been robbed. Not her. She'd paid $18 and gotten steel worth more than $18, whatever else was true. Not the town. The town had only laughed. The one who had actually been robbed, the only party in this whole business whose money had truly been taken, was whoever had opened that strongbox in 1864 and paid a claim on a cargo that had never sunk at all. So she took a clean sheet of paper, and she wrote one letter. She wrote to Charter Marine and Inland Assurance Company of Hartford, the underwriter named in the loss file. She did not write to a newspaper. She did not write to the sheriff. She wrote, in her plain, careful hand, to the only party who had standing to want the truth, and she told them what she had. A wagon of rifles, bought at public auction as unclaimed freight, a shipper's stencil under the rust, a consignment number stamped inside the lock plates, the same number, twice over. A loss file in the county recorder's office, dated the winter of 1864, for that same cargo, that same name, and in the margin of that file, the word paid. She wrote it in 4 lines, and then a little more. She did not accuse anyone by name. She did not know enough to. And it was not her way. She only set down what the iron said, and what the paper said, and let the 2 of them agree in front of a stranger who would know what it meant. She sealed it. She addressed it to Hartford. And in the last week of October, going into the first week of November, she carried it down to the eastbound mail herself, and she watched it go. And she told not a single soul in Ashford Bend what was in it. Then she went home and kept the yard running as if nothing at all had changed. That is the part I want you to sit with. Because right now, as that letter rides east, Della Harrow holds every piece of this, and the men who wouldn't bid, the whole silent room of them, still believe those secrets are buried under 4 years of rust in a widow's yard. They priced the iron. Every one of them. Not one of them thought to wash it. They don't know yet that she has. The entry was a loss report. 4 years old. Filed in the winter of 1864. It named a steamer. The Signet, out of St. Joseph, bound downriver with a consignment of arms. It named the shipper, too, the same name off her stencil, Halvison and Rook, freight agents. And beside the entry, in a second clerk's hand, was a single word that Della read 3 times before she believed it. Paid, She stood very still in that cold basement. The clerk waited. She asked him, quiet, what the word meant. He told her the way a man tells you the time. The cargo went down in the river. The owners filed on their insurance. The insurance company paid the claim. That was all. It happened all through the war. Boats sank, and the underwriters made it good, and the river kept whatever it took. Della thanked him. She copied the steamer's name into her account book, under the 2 numbers she already carried. Then she walked back up the courthouse stairs into the gray light, and she did not feel the cold. Because she understood now. She understood the whole thing at once. The way you understand a barrel is cracked the moment your thumb finds the seam. A shipment of 40 rifles had been declared lost in the Missouri in 1864. The insurers had paid for it as sunk, and when an insurer pays a claim, the goods become theirs. That is the whole of it. That is the bargain. They cover your loss, and whatever you lost belongs to them from that day on, wherever it turns up, whenever it turns up. But this cargo had never gone to the bottom. It had sat 4 years in the corner of a river warehouse, marked twice over so it could always be named, and then it had been rolled out onto an auction floor and sold to her, a widow, for $18 as unclaimed scrap with no papers and no provenance. Guns that were supposed to be under the river. Guns that already belonged, in law, to whoever had paid the claim in Hartford or Chicago or wherever the money had come from. She had not bought 40 rifles. She had bought the proof that they were never lost at all. Della walked home slow. She did not stop at the store. She did not speak to a soul. Tobias met her at the yard gate with his hands raw from the brushes, and he saw her face, and he asked what was wrong. Nothing was wrong, she told him. Go wash up. And she went and sat at Samuel's bench in the shed, among the fused iron and the smell of oil, and she thought. She thought about the room. A dozen dealers. Not one hand raised. She had told herself it was scorn. A woman buying junk. But scorn bids you up for sport. Scorn buys the lot cheap and laughs at you after. Scorn does not sit on its hands and hold its breath and pray the gavel falls fast. That room had not been laughing at her. That room had been waiting for the wagon to leave. To leave and rust and be melted and gone, so that nobody would ever wire brush a barrel and read what was under the rot. Crandall had wanted that lot dead. Anonymous. Weighed and poured and forgotten. And she had cleaned it. Now, here was the thing she turned over longest, sitting at her husband's bench. A woman in her place might do a dozen things with what she knew. She might march back to Kettles and shame the room. She might hold the guns for ransom. She might whisper the story around town and watch the dealers squirm. She might sell the whole wagon back to Crandall at 100 times what she paid and call it justice. Della did none of those things. Because every one of them put her in the middle of it. And she was one widow with a boy and a failing yard, against a ring of men who had already shown they could keep a whole room silent when it suited them. Any move she made herself, they could break. But she was not the party who had been robbed. The money that had been taken 4 years back had not been taken from Della Harrow. It had been taken from whoever paid that claim. A company. Somewhere east. A company with lawyers and standing and a long memory and every reason in the world to want back what it had paid for and never received. She did not need to fight the ring. She needed only to tell the one party who could. So she did the smallest thing, the quietest thing. She trimmed the lamp, and she took a clean sheet, and in her plain, steady hand she wrote a letter. She wrote to the underwriter. It took her some asking, over the next days, to learn the name, but the recorder's file had a notation, and a river agent in St. Joseph confirmed it. Charter Marine and Inland Assurance Company of Hartford, Connecticut, the house that had carried the war risk on Halverson and Rook. She did not accuse anyone in the letter. She named no dealer. She made no demand. She wrote only what she had, plainly, that she had purchased at public sale a wagon of rifles sold as unclaimed material. That upon cleaning them, she had found a shipper's stencil and consignment numbers. That the numbers appeared again, stamped inside 2 separate lock plates. That the steamer named on the stencil matched a loss reported in the county in 1864, marked paid. And that she thought perhaps the company would want to know its sunken cargo was sitting dry in a shed in Ashford Bend, Missouri. She copied the numbers into the letter exact. Both of them. She copied the steamer's name. She gave her own name and the road to her yard. Then she read it over once, and at the bottom, before she signed it, she thought of the room again. The flat hands, the held breath. And she almost smiled, though it was not a happy thing. They all priced the iron, she thought. Not one of them thought to wash it. She signed it. Della Harrow. She sealed it. In the morning she gave it to the man who carried the eastbound mail, and she watched the wagon go until it turned past the church and she couldn't see it anymore. And then she went home and cleaned iron, because there was a yard to run and a winter coming, and a letter takes a long time to reach Hartford. Here is what made those next weeks strange. Della knew everything now, and the town knew nothing. She carried the whole shape of it inside her while she sold walnut stock by the pound and mended a neighbor's harness and salted the last of the pork. The ring did not know she had cleaned the lot down to the marks. Crandall passed her on the street and did not even nod, and she thought, "You do not know what I found under your scrap," and she said nothing. She kept the wagon in the shed under a tarp. She kept working it. Gentle now, careful, taking the rust off without taking the marks. She found the stencil clear on the one barrel, and she found the numbers in the 2 lock plates, and she set that one rifle aside, the clearest one, the one whose lock plate read plainest of all. She stood it in the corner of the little office by the door. Dead weight at the sale, now the surest thing she owned. Tobias asked her once why they weren't melting it. "Because it's worth more clean than melted," she told him, which was true, and was not the whole truth, and he was 12 and let it lie. But Ashford Bend is a small town. A widow laughed out of a freight sale, seen walking into the recorder's office with a name in her book, seen since bent over that same rust-welded wagon night after night with a lamp and a brush, instead of a sledge and a crucible. That gets noticed. That gets talked about. And talk in a small town runs downhill, and it runs toward the men who most want to hear it. It reached Crandall in the 3rd week. The first sign was the scrap buyer, Deakins, the barge man, who had come once early and been turned away. He came again now, and there was no ease in him. He offered real money, not scrap money. He offered to take the whole wagon, as it stood, cleaned or not, that day, and he named a figure that would have carried the yard clear through spring. Della had learned to be still. She thanked him. She said she hadn't finished the work and didn't like to sell a thing half done. Deakins pressed. He got a color in his face. He said she was a fool to hold out on cash in hand with winter on the road. She said maybe she was, and she did not sell. He left angry, and she watched him go, and she thought, "They know. Somehow, they know I cleaned it." And a shipment reported sunk does not just wash up in a warehouse in the same town as the men who wouldn't bid on it. Someone put it there. Someone kept it there. A whole room that knows to leave one wagon alone is not a careful room. It is a room with a secret it shares. The numbers named the thing. Della only guessed at the men. But she was near enough now to guess right. They came properly the next week. 3 of them. Crandall in the middle, and 2 dealers flanking, and they came up the yard road in a good buggy like men paying a call. Crandall was smiling. That was the worst of it, that he had decided to smile. He admired the yard. He said Samuel had kept a fine operation, and it was a shame, a real shame, to see a woman carrying it alone. He said the town thought well of her. He said he'd heard she'd taken on that old fused lot from Kettles and been at it with the brushes, and wasn't that just like a Harrow, all that patience, and he laughed, and the two others laughed. Then he made his offer. For the lot. A number 3 times what Deacons had said. Cash. That week. And there was more, he said after. There was always work in the county for a widow the dealers looked out for. Iron to be pointed her way. A hard winter made easy. He wanted her to understand, being neighborly. Della stood in her own yard with her raw hands at her sides, and she looked at Josiah Crandall. She thought about the warehouse. Iron's iron, widow, don't go looking for a maker's mark on rot. The room laughing. That's a generous price, she said for scrap. Crandall's smile did not move, but something behind it did. It's a generous price for a neighbor, he said. I'll think on it, she said. I don't like to sell a thing half cleaned. And that was all. She would not sell, and she would not accuse, and she gave him nothing to grip. He climbed back in the buggy without the smile, and one of the others looked back at her as they rolled out, and that look told her plainer than anything that she had guessed the shape of it exactly right. That night she was afraid, and she will tell you so. She had staked the yard on an envelope somewhere east of the Mississippi, and here were 3 men who could void her sale, lean on kettle, close every scale in the county to her iron, and starve her out by Christmas. She had no letter back. She had only her own guess that a company in Hartford would care about 40 rifles 4 years cold. The letter from Charter Marine came in the last week of October. She saw the Hartford postmark, and her hands were not steady opening it. It was 4 lines. It thanked her for her communication. It said the matter had been referred. It said the company would be in contact should it require further particulars. It said nothing else. No promise. No man coming. Nothing a person could hold. And that same week, the county closed around her like a fist. Deacons withdrew his offer and would not meet her eye on the street. The mill that took her walnut suddenly had no need of walnut. The 2 nearest scales, at Kettle's and at the freight dock, were both, she was told, out of order, indefinitely. So sorry, ma'am. Crandall had put the word out. No one would weigh her iron. No one would buy her scrap. A widow with a yard full of metal she could not sell, and a wagon under a tarp she would not sell, and a curt letter from a company that had likely already filed her under the crank correspondence. Tobias asked if they were going to be all right. Della said yes. She did not know if it was true. She had never lied to the boy before, and she was not sure she had not lied to him then. She held anyway. She did not go back to Crandall. She did not sell the wagon. She fed the fire small and ate less, and waited on the mail like a woman waits on a doctor. The second letter from Hartford came the first week of November. It was longer. It was still cold and careful, and said very little a person could quote. But it said the one thing. The company was sending a man. His name was Thaddeus Vane, and he came into Ashford Bend on a Tuesday in the middle of November, on the noon coach, in a black coat, with a locked case, and a way of not looking at anyone in particular. And the first thing that everybody noticed about the adjuster from Charter Marine and Inland was where he went. He did not go to the dealers. The town had braced for it. Crandall most of all. A company man in a black coat, that meant meetings, that meant offers, that meant the trade sitting down with the trade to settle a thing among men who understood each other. That is how it had always gone. That is how these matters were smoothed. Vane never crossed the warehouse floor. He never sent his card to Crandall. He did not call on Della either, not at first, and that puzzled her until she understood it. He asked the coach agent for the way to the courthouse, and he carried his case down into the basement, to the recorder's office, and he set it on the clerk's table, and he asked for the county warehouse receiving books, and the freight ledgers, and the 1864 loss file. He asked for paper. He asked nothing of any man in the trade. The town watched him not come to them. That was its own kind of terror, for the men who had a reason to be visited. A company that wants to deal comes to your shop. A company that has already decided goes to the record. He was in the basement 4 days. Della went down on the second day when word reached her that he'd asked, quietly through the clerk, whether the woman who wrote the letter still had the iron. She brought the one rifle. The clear one. She set it on the records table in front of Thaddeus Vane, the dead weight from the sale, the thing that had risen under her brush, and she turned the lock plate to the lamp so he could read the stencil stamped inside it. Vane looked at it a long time. Then he looked at her, the first time he'd really looked at anyone since he stepped off the coach. "You cleaned this yourself," he said. "My husband taught me. You clean iron before you sell it. Always? 40 of them?" "Near enough." "This one reads best." He turned the plate to the lamp again. He read the number off it aloud. Slow. And then he opened the 1864 loss file to a page he had already marked, and he read the same number off the manifest of the steamer Signet, the cargo that had gone to the bottom of the Missouri 4 years before, with all its arms aboard. They matched to the last figure. Vane did not smile. Della would come to learn he never much did. But he set the rifle down very carefully, the way a man sets down something that has just become evidence, and he said, "Mrs. Harrow, I'd be obliged if you left this in the county's keeping until I'm done. It's the best witness in the building." She left it on the table. It stood there 4 days, in the lamplight among the ledgers. And here is what Thaddeus Vane did over those 4 days, without ever raising his voice or crossing the warehouse floor. He laid the 2 consignment numbers, the one off Della's barrel stencil and the one stamped inside her lock plates, beside the 1864 manifest of the Signet. They matched. That told him what the cargo was. Then he laid them beside the county warehouse receiving ledger. And that is where the floor went out from under Josiah Crandall, though he did not yet know it, sitting in his shop across town. Because the receiving ledger showed the crates signed in. At Ashford Bend. Weeks after the river was said to have taken them, 40 crates of arms, consigned under Halverson and Rook, received into the North Warehouse and signed for in a local hand in the spring of 1864, at a time when they were supposed to be lying under the Missouri and the claim on them already going east to Hartford to be paid. The steamer had never lost that cargo. Or it had, and the cargo had been fished, or it had never been aboard at all, and only the paper said it was. It did not matter which, for the purpose of the thing. The guns had been declared sunk. The guns had been paid for as sunk. And the guns had, that same season, been signed into a warehouse 2 counties from where they were said to have drowned, and sat there and been quietly rolled out 4 years later as anonymous scrap, to be melted before anyone could read them. The provenance was in the iron. The paper only agreed with the iron. The stencil, the stamps, the manifest, the receiving book, 4 separate things laid in a row, and every one of them said the same number, and the number said the guns were never lost, and the loss had been paid. Vane wrote it all out in a clean hand. He was, the clerk said after, the most silent man ever to sit at that table. He asked the trade for nothing. The ledger was his witness. The iron was his witness. Della's 4 days of brushwork was his witness. He needed no man in the county to say a word. But the men said words anyway. That is how these things go once the ground shifts. The ones who are guilty cannot bear the silence, and they fill it, and the filling is the confession. Amos Kettle came to the basement on the 3rd day. Unasked, he had gone through his own sale book at home, some instinct or some rumor turning him back through the pages, and he had found the lot, and the $18, and his own hand recording it, sold as material, no provenance. And Amos Kettle, who moved lots by the pound and never asked a question in his life, stood at Vane's table gone gray in the face, saying he had only sold what was brought to him. He hadn't known. Before God, he hadn't known what he was moving. Vane looked at him and said, mildly, that he was sure of it, and asked him only to leave the sale book. Kettle left it. He did not sleep well again for some time, they say. Then came Loomis, a lesser dealer, a follower, a man who had kept his hand flat on the table in that room because Crandall's hand was flat, and you did what Crandall did. Loomis came to Vane before Vane ever sent for him, which is a thing a guilty man does, and an innocent one never thinks to. He wanted, he said, to explain his part, which he was sure was a small part, which he wanted it understood was a very small part. He talked for an hour. He gave Vane names and dates the ledger had not quite given him. He confessed a thing nobody had yet accused him of, and in confessing it, made it real, and made the others real with him. Vane wrote it down and thanked him, and said nothing about mercy, because it was not his to give. Crandall came last, and Crandall did not come on his own legs, the way Kettle came, or scurry in ahead of the summons, the way Loomis did. Crandall came because a writ came for him. Not from Della. She never signed a paper against him. Never spoke his name to Vane. The writ came from the company, Charter Marine and Inland, the lawful owner of 40 rifles it had paid for in 1864, requiring Josiah Crandall to answer for a consignment he had sworn on a public floor was worthless scrap. They served it at his shop. And the answering was done, by Vane's arrangement and the county's, in Kettle's freight warehouse. The same floor, the same high cold room where Crandall had said iron's iron, widow, don't go looking for a maker's mark on rot, and the dealers had laughed. The same men were there, not laughing now. Crandall stood on that floor, and Vane laid it in front of him without heat. The manifest, the receiving ledger, the 2 lock plates, the stencil. Vane did not call him a thief. Vane did not need the word. He read the numbers. He read the date the crates were signed in. He read the date the river was said to have taken them, and he let the 2 dates sit in the air of that warehouse, weeks apart, and he asked Josiah Crandall to account for how a cargo lying at the bottom of the Missouri came to be signed into a warehouse a day's wagon ride south of St. Joseph. Crandall had no number to answer the numbers with. He tried the old voice first, the loud one, the one that ran the room. He said this was a woman's mischief and a company's greed dressed up together. But the room that had backed him with its silence gave him nothing now, because Loomis had already talked, and Kettle had gone gray over his own book, and the ledger was the ledger, and there is no shouting down a date signed in your own trade's hand. Vane never raised his voice to match him. Vane spoke to him only through the numbers, and the numbers did not care how loud he was. Della was in the warehouse for it. She had not asked to be. Vane had asked her to bring the rifle one last time, the clear one, to set on the table beside the papers, and so she stood at the back with her boy while Crandall came apart in front of the men he had led. She did not gloat. She will tell you she felt no joy in it, only a kind of hard quiet, the way you feel when a long cracked beam finally goes, and you're only glad you were standing clear. When it was done, the thing was plain to everyone in the county. Charter Marine and Inland recovered its cargo, the 40 rifles it had owned in law since the day it paid the claim, and recovered along with them its standing, which is the thing companies guard hardest of all. The guns were theirs. They had always been theirs. And Della Harrow was cleared. A good faith purchaser, Vane called her, in front of all of them. A woman who bought at open sale, in good faith, for value, and who, upon finding what she'd found, had done the one honest thing and written to the party with the right to know. The company did not take her for a thief, and did not treat her as one. It thanked her. More than thanked her, in that same warehouse, on that same floor, before the same men who had laughed her out of it in the spring, Thaddeus Vane paid Della Harrow a finder's consideration on behalf of Charter Marine and Inland Assurance. A lawful sum. An earned one. Not a fortune, not a lottery, nothing that fell out of the sky. A fair recognition, paid in public, for saving a company the cost of its own 4-year-old blindness. $18 she had paid. And the room had laughed. She took the company's fair consideration with a plain thank you and did not make a speech. She shook Thaddeus Vane's hand, and he almost smiled, that once, and told her Samuel Harrow had taught her a good trade. Then she took her boy and the one clean rifle Vane said she might keep, and she went home. There was iron to sell, and a yard to run, and a winter that all at once she was going to make. It is spring in Ashford Bend now, and the yard is solvent. The scales work again. Every scale in the county works again. For Della Harrow's iron the same as any man's, because it is understood now, quietly and permanently, that her iron is honest, and her word is good, and the men who said otherwise are not the men you want to be standing with. She sells clean. She always cleans before she weighs. Cleaned iron sells better than dirty iron, Samuel always said, and now the whole county has seen exactly how much better. Tobias runs the wire brush most days. He is 13 this spring, and he is getting good at reading a barrel, at telling iron from junk, at finding the mark under the rot. His mother taught him, the way her husband taught her. It goes down like that, the good skill, hand to hand. On the wall of the little office by the door hangs one rifle. The clearest one. The lock plate is wiped down to the bright metal now, and if you take it off its pegs and turn it to the window, you can read the shipper's stencil plain as the day it was stamped, the name and the row of numbers that spent 4 years under the rust waiting for somebody with the patience to bring them back. It hung dead weight at a sale. It rose under a brush. It stood witness on a records table. Now it hangs clean on a wall, and Della looks at it sometimes and thinks about how close it came to the crucible. Josiah Crandall's shop is shut. The company's suit saw to that, and the trade saw to the rest, because the trade will forgive a hard man, but it will not do business with a marked one. Amos Kettle still runs his freight and still cries his sales, but he opens every lot now before he sells it. He does not move a thing by the pound anymore that he has not first looked inside. He learned that the expensive way, and to his credit, he learned it for good. And Della keeps the yard her husband left her, and keeps her son, and keeps the one rifle on the wall to remind her of the plain thing at the middle of the whole business. A dozen men in a cold room looked at that wagon, and every one of them saw the same thing. They saw scrap. They priced it by the pound. They knew, some of them, exactly what it was, and they were counting on the rest of the world to see only the rust. Not one of them thought to wash it. That was all it ever took. A brush, and the patience to use it, and the plain habit of cleaning a thing before you judge it. The truth was there the whole time, sitting in the open, under 4 years of rust, waiting on the one person who would bother to wipe it clean. If you've watched this far, I'd like to know where you're watching from. Comment the name of your town below. I want to see how far this story travels.